The Biden administration will unveil new school reopening guidelines. CBS News obtained a draft of the CDC guidance. It details a color-coded plan for phase. Reopenings based on community transmission. Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is here to break it all down for us. Nancy, how will this work? How will schools know which zone they're in?
Good morning to both of you. So this is a pretty complicated set of guidelines. So I'm going to try to walk you through it carefully. But basically, what these guidelines are going to do is divide schools into 4 different color categories depending on how high transmission rates of the disease are in your particular area. And based on that, you know what kind of schooling you can anticipate in your area. So schools with low community spread in the area, those would be in the blue and yellow zones. They would reopen with full in-person learning and as much social distancing as possible. So you could go back to school, you could do it in person, you just have to distance as much as you could in a classroom. Schools in the orange zone, where transmission rates are higher, would be recommended for hybrid or reduced attendance with required distancing. So you could go back to school, but you'd have to have that mandatory 6 feet, we believe, between students. And then the same guidance goes for schools in the red zone, as long as they are regularly testing staff and students. So this is the area with the highest transmission. And for red zones that don't test, the CDC would recommend that elementary schools have reduced attendance with mandatory distancing and virtual-only classes for middle and high schools. So if you're in an area with very high transmission, the CDC is recommending that your middle and high schools remain virtual. Now, the guidelines are also expected to include mitigation strategies like masks and hand washing, resources devoted to under-resourced communities, prioritizing teachers for vaccines, and accommodating high-risk educators with virtual teaching or flexible schedules. Now, one of the things we still don't know is what qualifies as low, medium, high transmission risk. They haven't given us those numbers yet, but this gives you a sense of where the CDC is heading. And as we've heard from the CDC director over the past few days, they are going to say when these guidelines are announced that teachers do not have to be vaccinated in order for students to return to school in person. They don't believe that that is a prerequisite, though, of course, they argue that teachers should be prioritized so that they can get the vaccine before others in the community.
So let me ask you about the president and what he is set to do with governors and mayors from around the country today. We know that they are set to discuss the coronavirus relief package, and the list is made up of officials from both sides of the aisle. So what is the president hoping to accomplish by meeting with this group?
Well, he knows that a lot of Republican office holders around the country, governors and mayors, are more supportive of his big coronavirus relief package than Republicans in Congress are. And there's a very simple reason for that. These state and local office holders need the money, and they argue that their budgets are really strapped because of their efforts to deal with coronavirus, and they want the state and local funding that the president is promising in this bill. So they're hoping that by highlighting these Republicans as much as they can, by inviting them to the White House, by talking to them remotely, that will put pressure on Republicans in Congress to come around and support this. But there's a second reason, too, and that is because there are a lot of governors in recent days who, frankly, have expressed frustration that they can't get more of the vaccine. They say things are working better now, they're more organized. They know how much vaccine they're getting, but it isn't enough, and they're running out. And they're incredibly frustrated. They want to vaccinate people more quickly. They now have a vaccination apparatus set up so that they can do it. They just need more supply. And so this meeting is partially about sort of getting them up to speed on the White House efforts to increase supply. President Biden just announced yesterday that he has finalized an order for 200 million more vaccines, 100 million from Moderna, 100 million from Pfizer. He talked about this first a week or two ago, but now he says that actually the order date is being moved up so that the U.S. can get those vaccines by the end of May. He's now projecting that the entire U.S. adult population can be vaccinated by the end of July. So he's going to update a lot of these Democrat and Republican mayors and governors today about that progress.
So you mentioned that the president was out and about on the lawn there earlier this morning. The president was asked about the ongoing impeachment trial, and I want to play what his response was.
I'm just anxious to see what my Republican friends do, whether they stand up.
And you're not planning to speak with any of them about what they can do or how they can do it?
No, I'm not.
I think it's sort of interesting because he's really tried to avoid making any sort of commentary at all. So hearing that he's going to be watching the Republicans, I thought was interesting. What did you make of what he had to say?
Well, he's trying to put a little bit of pressure on his former Republican colleagues in the Senate, saying that they need to stand up and essentially vote to impeach, but at the same time, not wading into it too much, because one thing that the House impeachment managers have tried very hard to do is to not make this a partisan issue, to say this isn't about right versus left, Democrats versus Republican. This is about the president's conduct, and it has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with what side you're on. It has to do with what he said to his own supporters, the fact that he argued that the election had been stolen from him because he didn't like the fact that he lost. And that's why the White House has, for the most part, really tried to stay out of this, because they don't want this to be about the current president versus the last president, the Democrat in the White House versus the Republican in the White House. They want this to be more of a black and white matter of right versus wrong. And so surely Joe Biden has a lot of thoughts about impeachment, but at this point he's trying to keep most of them to himself because he realizes that would probably not help the case that the impeachment managers have been making.
You know, just one note on that video of the president, it's just sort of refreshing. This is objectively speaking for the president of the United States to call the members of the opposition, Republicans, his friends. And I note that only because today is President Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and I'm always constantly reminded of President Lincoln's quote or his words where he says, you know, we are not enemies, but friends, and though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of our affection. And so just in honor of Lincoln's birthday, it's just something we haven't heard of in the last 4 years of a president of the United States, you know, calling the members of the other side of the aisle his friends, which I know President Biden feels that the members of the United States Senate, where he spent the better part of his career, are his friends, at least personally speaking. So let me ask you this, Nancy. The Biden administration also announced today that they're planning to allow tens of thousands of asylum seekers from Mexico to be released into the U.S. while their cases are pending. Of course, this move dismantles former President Trump's policy. How's it going to work, and what are the COVID-19 precautions that they're taking?
Right. So this is going to be done on a staggered basis. These individuals are not all going to be allowed into the U.S. at once, but it is definitely a reversal of a Trump-era policy. So there are about 25,000 or so asylum seekers who have been waiting in Mexico as part of this Remain in Mexico policy that the Trump administration put in place for asylum seekers. And they've been living, in some cases, in really terrible conditions, essentially slum-like conditions in Mexico, because these are people who traveled here from all over South America thinking that they were going to be able to get into the United States and await an asylum hearing here. Instead, they were told they had to stay on the other side of the border. And so they've been making do. And you can see some of that video that and still images that 60 Minutes had captured, and they're living in tense and very difficult conditions. So the Biden administration now says that these individuals are going to be let in, a few hundred at a time, as they wait for court hearings. And so those individuals, of course, will be tested as they come into the U.S. They haven't said exactly how long it will take to clear up the backlog, but it is, at the very least, progress for some of these people who have been living in those camps for years now, Vlad and Emery.
Nancy, thanks.